A man died in 1616 and we're still arguing about who he actually was. Not how good his plays were or what they meant, but whether he even wrote them at all. That question has consumed scholars, conspiracy theorists, and everyone in between for centuries. But before we get to the controversy, we need to understand the life itself, and that life began in a market town 60 miles northwest of London, in a world Shakespeare would spend his career trying to escape. Stratford-upon-Avon in 1564 wasn't charming. It was muddy, crowded, and reeked of animal waste and tanning chemicals. The Avon River provided water and commerce, but it also carried disease. Plague swept through regularly, killing without pattern or mercy. This was the England of Elizabeth I, a country finding its footing after decades of religious violence, where your faith could get you burned at the stake, depending on which monarch happened to be in power. William Shakespeare was baptised on April 26, 1564, at Holy Trinity Church. We don't know his exact birth date. Tradition says April 23rd, which would be poetically convenient, since that's also the date he died 52 years later, but it's likely guesswork. What we do know is that he was born into a family on the rise. His father, John Shakespeare, was a glover, a maker of fine leather goods. Gloves, belts, purses. But John was also ambitious. He bought property, traded in wool, and climbed the social ladder of Stratford's civic life, eventually becoming bailiff, essentially the town's mayor. William's mother, Mary Arden, came from minor gentry, a family with land and a name that meant something. This mattered in Elizabethan England, where status determined nearly everything. The Shakespeares weren't nobility, but they weren't peasants either. They occupied that crucial middle ground, where education was possible, where a clever boy might make something of himself. And William was the third child, but the first to survive past infancy. 2 sisters had died before him. In a world where half of all children didn't reach adulthood, survival itself was an achievement. He grew up in a house on Henley Street, a timber-framed building that still stands today, though how much of it is original is debatable. The ground floor would have been John's workshop, filled with the smell of leather and the tools of the trade. Upstairs, the family lived, slept, ate, existed in close quarters. Stratford had about 2,000 residents. Everyone knew everyone. The town's economy ran on market days when farmers brought goods to sell and craftsmen displayed their wares. There was a grammar school, the King's New School, and this is where William's story takes its first mysterious turn. We have no records of Shakespeare attending school. None. Not a single document places him in a classroom. But the King's New School was free to the sons of burgesses, and John Shakespeare qualified. The curriculum was standard for the era, brutal and thorough. Boys started at age 7, attending 6 days a week, 9 hours a day. They learned Latin, endless Latin, reading Ovid, Virgil, Horace, Cicero. They memorized, recited, translated, and were beaten when they failed. Everything in Shakespeare's plays suggests he received this education. His work is saturated with classical references, with stories from Ovid's Metamorphoses, with rhetorical techniques taught in grammar schools. But he never attended university. Oxford and Cambridge have no record of him. This becomes important later, when people start questioning whether the son of a glover could have written Hamlet. At 18, something happened that changed everything. William Shakespeare married Anne Hathaway. She was 26, 8 years older, and already pregnant. We know this because their first child, Susanna, was baptised 6 months after the wedding. The marriage required a special licence because it happened during Advent, when marriages were normally forbidden. Someone was in a hurry. Why did they marry? Was it love, obligation, scandal? We don't know. We never hear Shakespeare's voice on this. What we do know is that Anne came from Shottery, a village a mile from Stratford. Her family farmed. She was literate enough to make her mark, but probably couldn't write. And suddenly this 18-year-old, who might have been destined for his father's glove-making business, was a husband and soon a father. Susanna was born in May 1583. 2 years later, Anne gave birth to twins, Hamlet and Judith, named after their neighbours Hamlet and Judith Sadler. 3 children before William turned 22, and then silence. From 1585 to 1592, we lose Shakespeare completely. These are the lost years, and they've generated more speculation than almost any other period of his life. Where was he? What was he doing? How did a young father from Stratford end up in London writing plays for the greatest theatre companies in England? The theories are endless. Some say he worked as a school teacher in the country. Others claim he joined a travelling company of actors who passed through Stratford. One tradition says he was caught poaching deer from the estate of Sir Thomas Lucy and fled to London to avoid prosecution. Another suggests he worked as a lawyer's clerk, which would explain his detailed knowledge of legal terminology. We don't know. The documentary record is blank. But what we do know is that by 1592, William Shakespeare was in London working in the theatre and making enemies. The first mention of Shakespeare in London comes from a dying man's bitter attack. Robert Greene was a university-educated playwright, one of the so-called university wits who dominated London theatre in the 1580s. He wrote plays, pamphlets and romances, and he was watching his career collapse as newer writers gained prominence. In September 1592, Greene published a deathbed pamphlet attacking these upstarts. He warned his fellow university men about an upstart crow beautified with our feathers, who thinks he's the only Shakespeare in the country. Shakespeare, a pun on Shakespeare's name. The insult was clear. This actor, this man without a university degree, was daring to write plays and was succeeding. The resentment drips from every word. Here was someone from the provinces, someone who hadn't studied at Oxford or Cambridge, invading their territory and doing it well enough to threaten their livelihoods. Greene died shortly after writing this. His editor, Henry Chettle, later published an apology saying he regretted including the attack because Shakespeare was actually a decent man and an excellent writer. But the damage was instructive. It tells us that by 1592, Shakespeare was already established enough to be worth attacking, already successful enough to make university-educated writers nervous. London in the 1590s was the largest city in England, approaching 200,000 people, a chaotic explosion of commerce, crime, culture, and disease. The city proper sat within ancient walls, but it was spilling beyond them, sprawling into liberties and suburbs where authorities had less control. This is where the theatres were built, outside the jurisdiction of the London city fathers, who viewed plays as sources of immorality, plague, and disorder. The theatre scene was young, vibrant, and brutal. The first permanent playhouse, simply called the Theatre, had only been built in 1576 by James Burbage. Before that, acting companies performed in inn-yards, great halls, anywhere they could gather a crowd. Now there were multiple playhouses competing for audiences. The Theatre, the Curtain, the Rose. They were open-air structures, circular or polygonal, with a raised stage jutting into a yard where groundlings stood for a penny. Wealthier patrons sat in covered galleries. Performances happened in the afternoon, using natural light. There was no scenery to speak of, minimal props, but elaborate costumes. The companies were all male, with boys playing women's roles. They performed a different play nearly every day, requiring actors to memorize thousands of lines, and playwrights to produce new material constantly. It was an industry, a business, and it was growing. When Shakespeare arrived, probably in the late 1580s, he started as an actor. We know he performed because his name appears in cast lists later, including for Ben Jonson's plays. He was never a leading man. The great roles went to Richard Burbage, James's son, who would create Hamlet, Othello, and Lear. Shakespeare played supporting parts, and this put him in the perfect position to understand how plays actually worked on stage. What landed with audiences, what died. But he was writing too. His earliest plays are difficult to date precisely because publication didn't happen immediately and records are sparse. But scholars generally agree that by the early 1590s, Shakespeare had written the three parts of Henry VI, Richard III, the Comedy of Errors, Titus Andronicus, the Taming of the Shrew, and the Two Gentlemen of Verona. These early works show a writer learning his craft. The Henry VI plays are sprawling history plays, chronicling England's loss of France and descent into civil war. They're uneven, sometimes brilliant, sometimes clunky, clearly influenced by Christopher Marlowe's mighty line. Richard III is where Shakespeare found his footing, creating in Richard a villain so charismatic, so theatrically alive, that he dominates every scene. Titus Andronicus is a blood-soaked revenge tragedy, so violent it makes modern audiences uncomfortable, with 14 deaths, multiple rapes and mutilations, and a scene where a mother unknowingly eats her sons baked in a pie. Critics have spent centuries trying to explain away Titus, arguing it's too crude to be Shakespeare's, but it is his, and it was popular. Elizabethan audiences loved violence. They attended public executions for entertainment. Titus gave them what they wanted, while also showing Shakespeare's growing skill with language and structure. The comedies from this period are lighter, experimenting with mistaken identities, cross-dressing, and romantic entanglements. The Comedy of Errors borrows its plot from Roman playwright Plautus, but adds layers of wordplay and emotional depth. The Taming of the Shrew remains controversial for its treatment of Catherine, the sharp-tongued woman broken into obedience, though directors have found ways to play it as satire rather than endorsement. What's remarkable is the range. History, tragedy, comedy, sometimes blending all three. Shakespeare wasn't specialising. He was trying everything, figuring out what he could do, pushing against the conventions of each genre, and people were noticing. By 1594, the London theatre world had been devastated by plague. The outbreak of 1592 to 1594 was severe enough that the playhouses were closed for extended periods. Companies disbanded, actors fled to the countryside, playwrights scrambled for income. During this time, Shakespeare did something unusual. He wrote poetry. Venus and Adonis was published in 1593, dedicated to Henry Wriothesley, the young Earl of Southampton. It's a narrative poem, nearly 1,200 lines, retelling Ovid's story of the goddess Venus pursuing the beautiful youth Adonis, who rejects her and is killed by a boar. It's erotic, witty, and sophisticated, aimed at educated readers, not groundlings at the playhouse. The dedication is carefully worded, respectful but not grovelling, suggesting Shakespeare was seeking patronage. The following year, he published The Rape of Lucrece, also dedicated to Southampton, this time with warmer language, suggesting the patronage had been granted. This poem is darker, longer, dealing with the rape of the virtuous Roman wife Lucrece by Tarquin and her subsequent suicide. Both poems were popular, reprinted multiple times during Shakespeare's lifetime, and they established him as a serious literary figure, not just a playwright. Then there are the sonnets, 154 poems, published in 1609, but probably written over many years, mostly in the 1590s. They're some of the most analysed, debated, and obsessed over poems in English literature. Who is the fair youth addressed in the first 126 sonnets? Is it Southampton? Someone else? Who is the dark lady of the later sonnets? What is the nature of the relationships described? The sonnets break every convention. They're intensely personal, exploring love, desire, jealousy, aging, betrayal, art and mortality, with a directness that feels shockingly modern. Sonnet 18, Shall I compare thee to a summer's day, is famous for its beauty. Sonnet 130, My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun, subverts the entire tradition of idealized love poetry. Sonnet 129, About lust is so raw it's uncomfortable. Scholars have spent careers trying to identify the people in these poems, trying to reconstruct Shakespeare's private life from the clues within. But maybe that's the wrong approach. Maybe the sonnets are art, not autobiography. Shakespeare exploring emotional and psychological territory through invented voices. Or maybe they're both. We'll never know for certain, and that uncertainty drives people mad. What we do know is that when the plague finally subsided and the theatres reopened, Shakespeare was ready. He'd spent the closure writing, reading, thinking, and when he returned to the stage, he was a different writer. The next phase of his career would produce the works that made him immortal, but it would also bring professional triumph tangled with personal tragedy in ways that would haunt the plays themselves. The greatest theatre company in England was about to form, and Shakespeare would be at its centre, not just as a writer, but as a shareholder, an actor, and a businessman whose understanding of his craft was about to deepen in ways that would change literature forever. In 1594, something happened that would change English theatre forever. The Lord Chamberlain's Men formed, and William Shakespeare became a founding member. This wasn't just another acting company. The structure was different. Most companies were owned by a single manager who hired actors and playwrights as employees. The Chamberlain's Men operated as a joint stock company. 8 shareholders owned it collectively, sharing both risks and profits. Shakespeare was one of them. He wasn't just writing plays for hire anymore. He owned part of the enterprise, which meant he had creative control, financial incentive, and long-term stability that most playwrights could only dream of. The company's patron was Henry Carey, the Lord Chamberlain, one of the most powerful men at Elizabeth's court. That patronage provided protection and prestige. The leading actor was Richard Burbage, son of James Burbage, who had built the theatre back in 1576. Richard was the same age as Shakespeare, a brilliant performer who would create the roles of Hamlet, Othello, and Lear. He and Shakespeare developed a creative partnership that lasted decades. Other shareholders included John Hemingis and Henry Condell, actors who would later compile the first folio. Will Kempe was there too, the company's star comedian, a physical performer famous for his jigs and clowning. These men weren't just colleagues, they were business partners, collaborators bound by shared financial interest and artistic ambition. The Chamberlain's Men performed at the theatre in Shoreditch, north of the city walls. They also played at court regularly, more often than any other company. Between public performances and court appearances, they needed new material constantly. Shakespeare provided it at a rate that seems impossible, roughly 2 plays per year, every year, for the next 2 decades. Between 1594 and 1599, he wrote some of the most beloved works in English literature. Romeo and Juliet probably came first around 1595. It's a young play in some ways, full of verbal fireworks and emotional extremes, but it seized the public imagination immediately. The balcony scene, the feuding families, the double suicide, all of it became embedded in culture so deeply that it's hard to remember there was a time before these images existed. A Midsummer Night's Dream followed, a comedy of such delicate beauty and strange magic that it feels unlike anything else he wrote. 4 lovers lost in an enchanted forest, fairies meddling in human affairs, a group of amateur actors rehearsing a terrible play, Bottom transformed into a donkey and loved by the fairy queen. The play moves between courtly elegance and crude comedy, between lyric poetry and slapstick, somehow weaving it all into a coherent vision of love as irrational, transformative, and ultimately inexplicable. The Merchant of Venice is harder to categorize. It's listed as a comedy, and it has the structure of one, ending in marriages and reconciliation. But Shylock dominates the play in ways that make the comic resolution feel hollow. Is he a villain or a victim? The play gives ammunition to both readings. His speech, "Hath not a Jew eyes," is one of the most powerful pleas for common humanity ever written. But the courtroom scene where he demands his pound of flesh is genuinely terrifying. Audiences have argued about this play for 4 centuries, and the argument won't end. The 2 parts of Henry IV represent Shakespeare hitting a new level entirely. These are history plays, chronicling the reign of Henry IV and the education of his son, the future Henry V. But they're also sprawling social panoramas, moving from the royal court to the taverns of Eastcheap, from battlefields to brothels. Prince Hal, the heir to the throne, spends his time drinking with criminals and wastrels, especially Falstaff, one of the greatest characters in all of literature. Falstaff is fat, old, cowardly, dishonest, and utterly magnetic. He's a liar and a thief, but he's also witty, charismatic, and strangely wise in his cynicism about honour and war. Will Kempe probably played him, and the role became so popular that Elizabeth herself supposedly requested a play showing Falstaff in love, which led to the Merry Wives of Windsor. But in Henry IV, Falstaff represents everything Hal must reject to become a king. The relationship between them, the surrogate father and the wayward prince, is tender and doomed. When Hal finally rejects Falstaff in the final scene of Part 2, it's one of the most painful moments in Shakespeare. I know thee not, old man. Much Ado About Nothing gave audiences Beatrice and Benedick, perhaps the wittiest couple in comedy. Their verbal sparring is so sharp and delightful that the play's darker elements, the slander of Hero and her near death, almost feel like intrusions. Almost, but not quite. Shakespeare was learning to blend tones, to let darkness intrude on comedy, and comedy lighten darkness, creating something closer to the texture of actual experience. As You Like It offers the Forest of Arden as a green world of transformation, where characters flee from a corrupt court and discover who they really are. Rosalind, disguised as a young man, is one of Shakespeare's most intelligent and resourceful heroines. The play is playful about gender, about performance, about the relationship between nature and civilization. Julius Caesar marks a shift. It's 1599, and something in Shakespeare's work is deepening. This is a tragedy, but a political one, examining power, rhetoric, and the consequences of assassination. Brutus kills Caesar, believing he's saving the Republic, but his idealism is manipulated by Cassius and leads directly to civil war. Mark Antony's funeral oration, Friends, Romans, Countrymen, is a masterclass in manipulation, showing how language can turn a crowd from mourning to murderous rage. The play is lean, focused, brutal. It feels Roman in a way that's hard to define, but impossible to miss. During these years, the Chamberlain's men were the most successful company in London, and Shakespeare was becoming wealthy. He wasn't just earning from his shareholders' portion of the company's profits. He was also paid for the plays themselves, and he was acting, though probably in smaller roles, as his writing consumed more time. In 1597, he bought New Place in Stratford, the second largest house in town. It was a statement. The glover's son had made it. He applied for a coat of arms for his father, which was granted. The Shakespeare family was now officially gentlefolk. The motto on the coat of arms was non sans droit, not without right. Some saw it as pretentious, some still do, but Shakespeare never left London entirely. He maintained his career, his partnerships, his presence in the theatre world. He seems to have lived a split existence, part of the year in London working, part in Stratford with his family. We know he bought property, made investments, lent money. He was careful with his wealth, building security for his family. Yet personally, there are shadows. His son Hamlet died in 1596 at age 11. The cause is unknown. Plague, perhaps, or one of the many illnesses that killed children in those years. Shakespeare was likely in London when it happened. There's no record of his reaction, no letter, no diary entry. We only know that his only son was buried in Stratford on August 11th, 1596, and that Shakespeare never mentioned him in any surviving document. But the play's changed. Grief has a way of seeping into art whether the artist intends it or not. The later comedies are darker. The tragedies that were coming would be obsessed with fathers and children, with loss, with the fragility of life. Scholars have spent decades debating how much Hamlet's death affected the work, trying to trace the ghost of a dead boy through the plays. Maybe it's there, maybe we're projecting. All we know for certain is that after 1596, the work grew deeper, stranger, more willing to stare into darkness without flinching. Then in 1599, everything changed again. James Burbage had died in 1597, and the lease on the theatre was expiring. The landlord wanted to tear it down. So the Chamberlain's men did something audacious. They waited until the landlord was out of town, then dismantled the theatre themselves, timber by timber, and transported it across the Thames to Southwark. There, just outside the city's jurisdiction, they rebuilt it in a new form. They called it the Globe. It opened in the summer of 1599 with a new motto inscribed above the entrance: Totus mundus agit histrionem. The whole world plays the actor. It held 3,000 people, open to the sky, with a thrust stage that put the actors in intimate contact with the audience. The design was revolutionary, and it became the most famous theatre in the world. Shakespeare owned a share of the Globe itself, separate from his share in the company. He was now making money from admissions, from performances, from his plays. The financial security gave him freedom. He could take risks, experiment, push boundaries, and push he did. Because what came next was the period that would define him forever. The period when he wrote the 4 great tragedies that have never been equalled. The plays were about to get darker, deeper, more psychologically complex. The man who had written romantic comedies and patriotic histories was about to spend several years staring into the abyss, and what he found there would terrify and fascinate audiences for the next 400 years. Hamlet came first, probably in 1600 or 1601. It's the most famous play ever written, and it's strange in almost every way. It's too long, nearly 4,000 lines, twice the length of a normal play. It's structured oddly, with a revenge plot that the protagonist keeps delaying for reasons he himself can't fully articulate. The hero is melancholic, philosophical, cruel, tender, mad or pretending to be mad, and utterly compelling. The story is simple. Hamlet's father, the King of Denmark, has died. His mother Gertrude has married his uncle Claudius. With unseemly haste, Hamlet is disgusted. Then the ghost of his father appears and reveals that Claudius murdered him. The ghost demands revenge. Hamlet swears to do it, then spends the rest of the play failing to act, or acting in ways that make everything worse. Why doesn't he just kill Claudius? Scholars have proposed hundreds of explanations. He's paralyzed by thought. He's not sure the ghost is telling the truth. He's depressed. He's a coward. He's too sensitive for the brutal world he inhabits. The play supports all these readings, and none of them completely. What makes Hamlet inexhaustible is that he feels like a real consciousness, complex and contradictory in ways that fictional characters rarely are. His soliloquies, to be or not to be. Oh, what a rogue and peasant slave am I. How all occasions do inform against me. These aren't just beautiful poetry. They're a mind thinking in real time, wrestling with impossible questions about action, morality, death, and meaning. The play is also full of theatre. The players who arrive at Elsinore, Hamlet's advice to them about acting. The play within a play that Hamlet uses to catch the conscience of the king. Shakespeare is writing about his own art, questioning what theatre can do, what it's for, how it relates to truth. Richard Burbage played Hamlet, and it became his signature role. Audiences were stunned. The play was immediately popular and has never stopped being performed. Every generation finds something new in it. It's been read as a play about indecision, about existential despair, about Oedipal psychology, about political corruption, about grief. It's all of those and more. The tragedy isn't just that people die. The tragedy is that Hamlet's intelligence and sensitivity, the very things that make him extraordinary, make it impossible for him to function in a world that demands action over reflection. By the time he finally kills Claudius, it's almost accidental, and everyone else is dead too. Ophelia has gone mad and drowned herself. Polonius has been stabbed through a curtain. Laertes is dying from a poisoned sword. Gertrude has drunk poisoned wine. The stage is littered with corpses, and the final lines are spoken by Fortinbras, a minor character who's been off stage for most of the play, a man of action who will never understand what happened here. Around the same time as Hamlet, Shakespeare wrote Othello, a tragedy of a completely different kind. No ghosts, no philosophy, no delay, just a man destroyed by jealousy in about 3 days. Othello is a Moorish general in Venice, a military hero who has married Desdemona, a young Venetian noblewoman. Iago, Othello's ensign, is passed over for promotion and swears revenge. He convinces Othello that Desdemona is having an affair with Cassio, the man who got the promotion Iago wanted. The evidence is thin, circumstantial, based on misunderstandings and a planted handkerchief, but Iago is a master manipulator, and Othello, despite his military brilliance, is emotionally vulnerable, an outsider in Venetian society, insecure about his race and age. By the end, Othello has murdered Desdemona in their bed. When he discovers the truth, he kills himself. The horror of Othello is how easily it happens. Iago has no grand motive beyond wounded pride and a kind of creative malevolence. He improvises his plots, adjusting as he goes, delighting in his own cleverness. He speaks directly to the audience, bringing us into his confidence, making us complicit. We watch him destroy lives for almost no reason, and we can't look away. Othello is the opposite of Hamlet. Where Hamlet can't act, Othello acts too quickly, without thought. Where Hamlet is paralysed by doubt, Othello is destroyed by certainty. And where Hamlet's tragedy is intellectual, Othello's is visceral. The play is about how love can turn to violence, how trust can be weaponized, how identity and belonging make people vulnerable. King Lear came next, probably in 1605 or 1606, and it's the most brutal thing Shakespeare ever wrote. An old king decides to divide his kingdom among his 3 daughters based on how much they say they love him. The 2 elder daughters, Goneril and Regan, flatter him extravagantly. The youngest, Cordelia, refuses to play the game and says she loves him as a daughter should. Nothing more, nothing less. Lear disowns her, gives everything to the older 2, and within weeks they strip him of his retinue, his dignity, and finally his shelter. Lear goes mad wandering the heath in a storm, raging at the heavens. There's a subplot involving Gloucester, another old man betrayed by his children, blinded and cast out. The 2 plots mirror each other, doubling the suffering. By the end, almost everyone is dead. Edmund, Gloucester's bastard son, has orchestrated much of the carnage. Goneril poisons Regan and then kills herself. Cordelia is hanged in prison. Lear carries her body on stage and dies of grief. It's relentless. What makes Lear unbearable and profound is that the suffering seems meaningless. There's no ghost demanding revenge, no tragic flaw in the Aristotelian sense. Just old men making mistakes and a world that punishes them far beyond what they deserve. The play asks whether there's any justice in the universe, any order, any meaning, and it doesn't offer comforting answers. Lear's madness scenes are some of the strangest in Shakespeare. He tears off his clothes, believing that stripping away the trappings of civilization will reveal some essential truth. He holds a mock trial of his daughters, using a stool as a judge. He speaks in fragments, nonsense mixed with terrible insight. When he finally regains his sanity and is reunited with Cordelia, the reconciliation is heartbreaking, precisely because we know it won't last. She forgives him, and then she dies and he dies, and the survivors are left to pick up the pieces of a shattered world. Macbeth, written around 1606, is shorter, faster, more focused than Lear, but no less dark. It's a play about ambition and guilt. Macbeth is a Scottish general who encounters three witches who prophesy that he will become king. His wife, Lady Macbeth, seizes on the prophecy and pushes him to murder King Duncan while he sleeps as a guest in their castle. Macbeth does it, is crowned, and then has to keep killing to secure his position. He murders his friend Banquo. He has Macduff's wife and children slaughtered. The guilt drives Lady Macbeth mad. She sleepwalks, trying to wash imaginary blood from her hands, and eventually dies. Macbeth becomes a tyrant, isolated and paranoid, until Macduff kills him in battle. The tragedy of Macbeth is that he knows what he's doing is wrong. Before the murder, he lists all the reasons he shouldn't do it. Duncan is his king, his kinsman, his guest. He's a good king. Macbeth has no justification except ambition. He does it anyway, and the moment the deed is done, he knows he's destroyed himself. The rest of the play is him living with that knowledge, becoming harder and more brutal because he can't go back. Lady Macbeth is one of Shakespeare's most terrifying creations. She calls on spirits to unsex her, to fill her with cruelty so she can push her husband to murder. She mocks his hesitation, questions his manhood, and provides the resolve he lacks. But after the murder, she disintegrates. The strength was a performance, and once the performance cracks, there's nothing underneath but horror. The witches add a supernatural dimension. Are they causing events or just predicting them? Do they give Macbeth the idea or just confirm what was already in his mind? The play never answers. The prophecies come true, but in ways Macbeth doesn't expect. He's told no man born of woman can harm him, and he feels invincible until Macduff reveals he was from his mother's womb untimely ripped, born by caesarean section. The prophecy was true and misleading at the same time. Macbeth is also a play about sleeplessness. Macbeth murders sleep when he murders Duncan. After that, neither he nor his wife can rest. They're haunted, not by ghosts exactly, but by their own minds. The play's language is thick with darkness, blood, and images of things growing and rotting. It's claustrophobic, suffocating, a nightmare you can't wake from. These four plays, Hamlet, Othello, Lear and Macbeth, were written within about 6 years. They represent the summit of tragic drama in English, perhaps in any language. They're unbearable and essential. They show human beings at their most vulnerable, destroyed by flaws that are inseparable from their virtues. Hamlet's intelligence, Othello's passion, Lear's authority, Macbeth's ambition, these are the things that make them who they are, and they're the things that kill them. Shakespeare's tragedies don't offer easy morals. They're not cautionary tales. They're examinations of what it means to be human, to have consciousness, to make choices in a world that is indifferent or hostile. The characters suffer, and the suffering feels real, earned, unbearable. We watch because we recognize something of ourselves in them, and because the language transforms pain into something we can bear to witness. But Shakespeare didn't only write tragedies. Even during these dark years, he was writing comedies. Though the comedies were getting stranger, more ambiguous, more willing to stare into the same abyss the tragedies explored. Measure for Measure, written around 1604, is classified as a comedy because it ends with marriages, but it's one of the most uncomfortable plays Shakespeare ever wrote. The Duke of Vienna leaves the city and puts Angelo, his deputy, in charge. Angelo immediately cracks down on sexual immorality and sentences Claudio to death for getting his fiancée pregnant. Claudio's sister, Isabella, a novice nun, pleads for her brother's life. Angelo offers a deal. Sleep with me, and I'll spare him. Isabella refuses. The Duke, disguised as a friar, manipulates events so that Angelo ends up sleeping with Mariana, a woman he was once engaged to, thinking she's Isabella. In the final scene, the Duke reveals himself, forces Angelo to marry Mariana, and proposes to Isabella. It should be a happy ending. It's not. Angelo is a hypocrite and possibly a rapist. The Duke is a manipulative voyeur who's been controlling everyone the whole time. And Isabella, asked to give up her vocation and marry a man she barely knows, doesn't answer. In some productions she accepts, in others she's horrified. The text doesn't say. The play asks questions about justice, mercy, power and sexuality that it refuses to answer cleanly. All's Well, that ends well, written around the same time, is similarly uncomfortable. Helena, a poor physician's daughter, loves Bertram, a nobleman. She cures the King of France of an illness, and is granted any husband she chooses as a reward. She chooses Bertram. He's appalled, marries her because the king commands it, and immediately leaves for war, saying he'll never be a real husband to her unless she gets his ring and becomes pregnant with his child, which he considers impossible. Helena follows him, tricks him into sleeping with her through a bed trick, swapping places with another woman he's trying to seduce, gets pregnant and gets the ring. In the end he accepts her, sort of. It's framed as a happy ending, but Bertram is a spoiled, selfish coward, and Helena has essentially ed him into a marriage he never wanted. The tone is sour. These plays are sometimes called problem plays or dark comedies. They occupy a space between tragedy and comedy, unwilling to resolve their conflicts neatly. They show a Shakespeare less interested in providing comfort or closure, more interested in showing the messiness of human behaviour. Then, in the final phase of his career, something shifted again. The late plays, sometimes called the romances, are stranger still. They include Pericles, Cymbeline, The Winter's Tale, and The Tempest, written between about 1607 and 1611. These plays deal with loss, separation, suffering, and reconciliation. They're tragedies that become comedies, broken families that are miraculously reunited, wrongs that are forgiven, often after many years. The Winter's Tale is the most striking example. For the first 3 acts, it's a tragedy. Leontes, king of Sicilia, becomes irrationally jealous of his wife Hermione, convinced she's having an affair with his best friend Polixenes, king of Bohemia. He tries to have Polixenes murdered, fails and puts Hermione on trial. She's pregnant. She gives birth in prison. Leontes orders the baby abandoned in the wilderness. Hermione collapses and is reported dead. Their young son dies of grief. It's brutal, irrational, a family destroyed by one man's paranoia. Then there's a gap of 16 years. The baby, Perdita, has been found and raised by shepherds in Bohemia. She falls in love with Polixenes' son Florizel. Polixenes objects. The young lovers flee to Sicilia, and in the final act, everything is revealed. Perdita is recognized as Leontes' daughter. Paulina, Hermione's loyal friend, reveals that Hermione didn't die, but has been hidden for 16 years. She unveils a statue of Hermione, which comes to life. Hermione forgives Leontes. The families are reunited. It's a happy ending, but the years of suffering can't be undone. The son is still dead. The time is still lost. The play has a famous stage direction. Exit, pursued by a bear. It happens when Antigonus, the man ordered to abandon the baby, is chased off stage by a bear and killed. It's absurd and terrifying. Comedy and tragedy colliding. That tension runs through the whole play. The suffering is real, but so is the possibility of grace, of time healing, of forgiveness. The Tempest, probably Shakespeare's last solo play, written around 1610 or 1611, is a play about art, power, and forgiveness. Prospero, the rightful Duke of Milan, was overthrown by his brother Antonio and set adrift with his infant daughter Miranda. They landed on an island where Prospero has spent 12 years mastering magic. Using his powers, he creates a storm that shipwrecks Antonio and his allies on the island. Prospero has the chance for revenge. He controls everything, manipulating events like a playwright. But in the end, he chooses forgiveness. He gives up his magic, frees the spirit Ariel who has served him, and prepares to return to Milan. The play is full of meta-theatrical moments. Prospero stages a masque for Miranda and Ferdinand. He speaks of actors as spirits and spirits as actors. His final speech, asking the audience to release him with their applause, is often read as Shakespeare's own farewell to the stage. If it is, it's an ambiguous one. Prospero's power has been absolute, almost godlike, but he chooses to give it up. Magic, art, control over others, these are renounced in favour of humanity, mortality, forgiveness. The question of whether The Tempest was Shakespeare's farewell haunted scholars for centuries, but newer evidence complicates the story. He didn't stop writing entirely. He collaborated with John Fletcher on Henry VIII and the Two Noble Kinsmen, probably in 1613. These are competent plays, but they lack the fire of his earlier work. Something had shifted. Around 1613, Shakespeare essentially retired to Stratford. He was 49 years old, wealthy, accomplished, and apparently done with London. He bought property, managed his investments, and lived the life of a prosperous gentleman. The man who had created Hamlet and Lear spent his final years dealing with property disputes and grain prices. We have a few documents from these final years. In 1613, he bought a gatehouse near Blackfriars Theatre as an investment property. In 1614, he was involved in a controversy about enclosing common lands near Stratford. These are the mundane records of a businessman, not an artist. There are no letters about playwriting, no manuscripts, no evidence of the creative life that had consumed him for 25 years. Then in early 1616, he revised his will. The document is dated March 25th, though he may have been ill when he signed it. His handwriting on the 3 surviving signatures is shaky, deteriorating across the pages. Something was clearly wrong. The will is a fascinating and frustrating document. It's detailed about property, money, household items. His daughter Susanna gets most of the estate. His other daughter Judith gets a smaller bequest. Various friends receive small gifts, but there's almost nothing personal. Nothing that reveals the inner man. The most famous line in the will is an afterthought, an interlineation added after the main text was written. To his wife Anne, he left, "My second best bed." Scholars have debated this for 400 years. Was it an insult? Actually, the second best bed was typically the marital bed, the best bed being reserved for guests. So it might have been a sentimental gesture, ensuring she kept the bed they'd shared. Or it might have meant nothing at all, a standard provision he happened to spell out. What's striking is how little Anne appears in any record of Shakespeare's adult life. She's a ghost, married to him for 34 years, but almost completely absent from the documentary trail. Did they have a good marriage? A bad one? We have no idea. Shakespeare died on April 23rd, 1616. He was 52 years old. The cause of death is unrecorded. Later traditions claimed he died after a drinking session with Ben Jonson and Michael Drayton, but this is probably invention. Another story says it was a fever. We don't know. April 23rd is also traditionally celebrated as his birthday, which would mean he died on his 52nd birthday, but we only know he was baptised on April 26th. The birthday is an assumption. Still, the symmetry is appealing, the kind of poetic justice Shakespeare himself might have written. He was buried 2 days later, on April 25th, inside Holy Trinity Church in Stratford. This was an honour, a privilege of his status. Most people were buried in the churchyard. Shakespeare's grave is in the chancel, near the altar. Above the grave is a monument, probably erected within a few years of his death. It shows a half-length figure of Shakespeare holding a quill and paper, looking rather stiff and formal. The inscription praises him as a writer, comparing him to Nestor, Socrates, and Virgil. It's hyperbolic but sincere. Below, on the gravestone itself, is a curse. 4 lines warning anyone who disturbs the grave. Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones. It's crude poetry, nothing like Shakespeare's best work. Some scholars think he wrote it himself in his final illness. Others think it's the work of whoever commissioned the stone. Either way, it worked. The grave has never been opened. In 1623, 7 years after Shakespeare's death, two of his former colleagues from the King's Men, John Hemingis and Henry Condell, published the first folio. It's the most important book in English literature. Without it, half of Shakespeare's plays would have been lost forever. Before the first folio, only 18 of Shakespeare's plays had been published, some in badly corrupted versions. Hemingis and Condell gathered manuscripts, consulted prompt books, and assembled 36 plays into one massive volume. They left out Pericles and the Two Noble Kinsmen, perhaps considering them collaborations rather than Shakespeare's sole work. The first folio cost £1, expensive for the time. It was a large format, impressive and heavy. The title page features the famous engraving of Shakespeare by Martin Droeshout. It's not a great portrait. The head is too large for the body, the expression bland, but it's one of only 2 images we have that were definitely created during or shortly after Shakespeare's lifetime. Ben Jonson contributed a poem to the folio, a generous tribute despite their rivalry. He was not of an age, but for all time. Jonson got that right. In the 400 years since, Shakespeare has never fallen out of favour. His plays have been translated into every major language, performed on every continent, adapted into films, operas, musicals, novels. He's been claimed by every ideology, every culture, every generation. But who was he? After everything, what do we actually know about the man? The facts are frustratingly thin. We know where he was baptized, married, buried. We know he bought property and had children. We know he acted and wrote for the King's Men. We have 6 signatures, all spelled differently. We have no letters, no diaries, no manuscripts in his own hand, except possibly a few pages of a play called Sir Thomas More, and even that's disputed. What we have are the plays and poems, 38 plays and 154 sonnets. And from these, people have tried to reconstruct the man. Was he secretly Catholic? Some scholars point to possible Catholic sympathies in the plays, hidden references that a recusant audience would recognise. His father John was fined for not attending Protestant services. His daughter Susanna was cited for the same thing. But this is circumstantial, and Shakespeare's plays show no clear religious position. Was he gay or bisexual? The sonnets addressed to the young man are intensely passionate, expressions of love that go beyond friendship. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? That's Sonnet 18, addressed to a man. But Renaissance friendship allowed for passionate language that would seem romantic today. We can't know. Was he happily married? He spent most of his adult life in London while Anne stayed in Stratford. That might mean estrangement or simply practical necessity. Actors lived where they worked. No, we don't know. Did he believe in the divine right of kings, or was he a closet radical? His histories seem to support monarchy, but they also show incompetent and tyrannical kings. Plays like Coriolanus and Julius Caesar examine political power with unsettling ambiguity. Every ideology finds support in Shakespeare because he presents all sides. The scholar Stephen Greenblatt called this negative capability, a term borrowed from the poet Keats. Shakespeare had the ability to inhabit any perspective, to make every character's viewpoint convincing. He doesn't tell us what he thinks. He shows us what everyone thinks. This is why we can't pin him down. He's Hamlet and Claudius, Lear and Edmund, Prospero and Caliban. He's everything and nothing, everywhere and nowhere in his own work. The authorship question emerged in the 19th century and refuses to die. The theory goes that a glover's son from Stratford couldn't possibly have written these sophisticated plays. They show too much knowledge of law, court life, foreign countries, classical literature. Surely they must have been written by someone else, someone educated and aristocratic. who use Shakespeare as a front. Candidates have included Francis Bacon, Christopher Marlowe, who supposedly faked his death, and Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford. Entire books argue these cases with impressive detail and passionate conviction, but the evidence is overwhelmingly against them. Contemporary documents identify William Shakespeare of Stratford as the author. The first folio editors knew him personally. Ben Jonson, who also knew him, praised him by name. There's no historical evidence of any conspiracy or cover-up. The authorship theories rest on snobbery, the assumption that a middle-class provincial couldn't have been a genius. But genius doesn't require aristocratic birth. Shakespeare's knowledge of law, court life, and foreign places came from books, observation, and imagination. That's what writers do. The real mystery isn't whether Shakespeare wrote the plays, it's how he wrote them. How does a human mind create Hamlet's soliloquies, Lear's madness, Cleopatra's death, the fairies of A Midsummer Night's Dream, Falstaff's wit, Lady Macbeth's guilt? Harold Bloom argued that Shakespeare essentially invented modern human personality, the sense of an interior self that changes through reflection and choice. Before Shakespeare, literary characters were types. After Shakespeare, they were individuals, complex and contradictory, capable of surprising themselves. Think about Hamlet's transformation across the play. He returns from England a different person, calmer, more accepting. The readiness is all. That's not character development through external events. That's internal evolution, the self reconsidering itself. Or consider Macbeth's psychological disintegration. The man who starts as a loyal general ends as a nihilist who sees life as a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. We watch his conscience destroy him from within. Shakespeare understood that people contain multitudes, that we argue with ourselves, that we perform different roles for different audiences, that we don't fully know our own motivations. This seems obvious now, because Shakespeare taught us to think this way. His influence extends beyond literature into psychology, philosophy, politics. Freud's concept of the unconscious owes a debt to Shakespearean characters who don't understand their own desires. Political theorists from all sides quote Shakespeare to support their arguments. Phrases from his plays have become proverbs embedded so deeply in English that people use them without knowing the source. Break the ice, wild goose chase, heart of gold, foul play, wear your heart on your sleeve, the world's your oyster. All Shakespeare. He gave us the language to describe our own experience. When we say someone is green with envy, or caught in a love triangle, or facing their moment of truth, we're speaking Shakespeare's language. He didn't just write about life, he gave us the vocabulary and concepts to understand it. Yet the man himself remains hidden. We have the work, not the worker. The plays are transparent and the playwright is opaque. Maybe that's appropriate. Maybe the self-erasure was intentional, the ultimate act of negative capability. Shakespeare left us everything that matters, the plays and poems, and withheld everything we're curious about, his personal thoughts, beliefs, relationships. We have the gift and not the giver. What Shakespeare left behind was more than enough. The plays and poems he created between approximately 1590 and 1613 represent an output almost impossible to comprehend in its scope and quality. 37 plays, though scholars debate the exact count, 154 sonnets, several longer narrative poems, all this while acting regularly, managing shares in a theatre company, and somehow finding time to make shrewd property investments back in Stratford. The sheer productivity is staggering. During the most intense period of his career, he was writing roughly 2 plays per year. These weren't formulaic productions churned out mechanically. Each one explored different territory, experimented with form, pushed the boundaries of what theatre could accomplish. From the romantic comedy of As You Like It to the political tragedy of Julius Caesar to the domestic nightmare of Othello, written within just a few years of each other, each demanded total imaginative reinvention. Consider what he achieved in tragedy alone. Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, and Macbeth were all written within about 6 years. 4 of the greatest tragedies in any language, each completely distinct in structure, theme, and emotional landscape. Then he shifted to romance, producing The Winter's Tale and The Tempest, plays that blend tragedy and comedy into something entirely new, stories of loss and redemption that feel almost like myths. The genre classifications we use, comedy, tragedy, history, don't really capture what Shakespeare was doing. Measure for Measure is technically a comedy because it ends in marriage, but it's dark, disturbing, morally complex in ways that make the label absurd. The Winter's Tale contains one of the most shocking stage directions in theatre. Exit, pursued by a bear, marking the death of a character, yet it ends in resurrection and reconciliation. Shakespeare kept breaking his own rules. His understanding of theatrical craft was absolute. He knew exactly how long he could hold a pause, when to break tension with humour, how to structure a scene for maximum impact. The opening of Macbeth gives you 3 witches and thunder, immediately establishing atmosphere. The opening of Twelfth Night gives you music and a duke in love with love itself, setting an entirely different tone. First impressions were as calculated then as they are now. He also understood his audience with precision. The groundlings standing in the pit needed action, humour, spectacle. The wealthier patrons in the galleries wanted sophisticated wordplay, classical references, psychological depth. Shakespeare gave both groups what they wanted simultaneously. A fight scene entertains everyone, but the dialogue before the swords are drawn operates on multiple levels. Mercutio's Queen Mab speech in Romeo and Juliet dazzles with its imagery, while also revealing character and advancing theme. His actors were collaborators, not just interpreters. Richard Burbage, the company's leading man, originated roles like Hamlet, Othello, and Lear. Shakespeare wrote these parts knowing Burbage's strengths, his vocal range, his physical presence. The roles were tailored like bespoke suits. When Burbage died in 1619, a funeral elegy lamented that his characters died with him. No future Hamlet could quite match the original, because the part was built for a specific body and voice. The boy actors who played female roles presented particular challenges. Juliet, Cleopatra, Lady Macbeth. These psychologically complex women were performed by adolescent males. Shakespeare turned this limitation into opportunity. The disguise plots in the comedies, where female characters dress as men, become deliciously layered. A boy actor plays a woman pretending to be a man. In As You Like It, Rosalind disguised as a boy, then pretends to be Rosalind to teach Orlando how to woo. The audience watches a boy playing a girl playing a boy playing a girl. The theatricality becomes the point. Death appears constantly in the plays, but Shakespeare's treatment evolved dramatically across his career. The early tragedy, Titus Andronicus, features spectacular violence, characters baked into pies, hands and tongues cut off on stage. It's grand guignol, horror for shock value. By the time he writes Hamlet, death has become philosophical. To be or not to be contemplates suicide and mortality with unprecedented depth. The graveyard scene with Yorick's skull meditates on decay and memory. Violence still happens. The stage ends littered with bodies, but the focus has shifted inward. King Lear pushes further into the darkness. Gloucester's blinding happens on stage, brutally physical, but the real horror is existential. Lear howling over Cordelia's corpse, demanding why a dog, a horse, a rat should have life, and his daughter Nun asks questions about cosmic justice that have no comforting answers. The play offers no Christian consolation, no sense that suffering has meaning. It's almost unbearable. Then something shifts. The late romances, Pericles, Cymbeline, The Winter's Tale, The Tempest, don't deny death or suffering, but suggest the possibility of restoration. Characters thought dead return. Families separated are reunited. These aren't naive happy endings. The years lost can't be recovered. Hermione's 16 years as a statue can't be given back, but grace, forgiveness, second chances become possible. Some scholars see this as Shakespeare aging, confronting his own mortality, seeking reconciliation. Others note he was simply experimenting with different dramatic modes. Both can be true. The Tempest feels like a farewell. Prospero, the magician who controls the island through his art, renounces his power in the end. I'll break my staff, bury it certain fathoms in the earth, and deeper than did ever plummet sound, I'll drown my book. Then in the epilogue, he speaks directly to the audience, asking to be released freed by their applause. It's impossible not to read this as Shakespeare preparing to leave the theatre, the magician giving up his magic, the playwright stepping back from the stage. The sonnets present a different Shakespeare entirely. The plays were public, commercial, collaborative. The sonnets feel private, personal, risky. Published in 1609, possibly without his permission, they reveal desires and vulnerabilities the plays keep hidden. The sequence divides roughly into two parts. Sonnets 1 through 126 address a young man, beautiful and aristocratic, whom the poet loves with an intensity that goes beyond friendship. Sonnets 127 through 152 concern a dark lady, sexually compelling but cruel and unfaithful. A third figure appears, a rival poet competing for the young man's attention. The emotional landscape is complicated, messy, modern. The poet's love for the young man combines admiration, desire, jealousy, and self-abasement. He urges the youth to marry and have children to preserve his beauty, then contradicts himself by claiming his poetry will immortalize the young man more permanently than any offspring. He's tormented by the youth's infidelities, devastated when the young man sleeps with the dark lady, yet returns again and again. The dark lady sonnets are even more troubling. The speaker knows she's unfaithful, knows she lies, knows the relationship is destructive, but can't break free. My love is as a fever, longing still for that which longer nurseth the disease. This isn't courtly love poetry, where the lady is pure and the lover noble. This is addiction, compulsion, self-destructive desire, fully acknowledged. Sonnet 130 provides the clearest contrast with conventional love poetry. It systematically dismantles every cliché. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. He's mocking the exaggerated comparisons other poets use, but the final couplet turns the mockery into something genuine. And yet, by heaven, I think my love as rare as any she belied with false compare. Honesty becomes more romantic than fantasy. The sonnets also reveal Shakespeare's awareness of his own legacy. Sonnet 18, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" concludes with the famous promise. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. He knew the poems would outlast both himself and his subject. Sonnet 55 is even more explicit. Not marble, nor the gilded monuments of princes, shall outlive this powerful rhyme. That's not false modesty. That's a statement of fact proven correct across 4 centuries. Who were these people? The young man, the dark lady, the rival poet. Scholars have proposed countless candidates. The Earl of Southampton, to whom Shakespeare dedicated his narrative poems, is the most common suggestion for the young man. The dedication to the sonnets themselves refers mysteriously to Mr. W.H., leading to endless speculation. Was it William Herbert, Earl of Pembroke? Henry Wriothesley, with initials reversed? A printer's error? We'll never know with certainty. Does it matter? The biographical puzzle is endlessly fascinating, but the poetry transcends its origins. The emotions, jealousy, desire, fear of aging, the terror of being forgotten, these are universal. Reading the sonnets, you're overhearing someone's private thoughts about love and time and mortality. The specific identities of the other people involved matter less than the rawness of the voice speaking. That voice reveals insecurities the successful playwright kept hidden. Sonnet 29 begins, "When, in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state. This is despair, isolation, a sense of failure. Only thinking of the beloved restores hope." Sonnet 73 uses the metaphor of autumn and twilight to confront aging. "That time of year thou mayest in me behold, when yellow leaves, or none, or few, do hang upon those boughs which shake against the cold." He's watching himself decline, feeling vitality slip away. The fear of oblivion haunts multiple sonnets. Sonnet 55, already mentioned, tries to defeat time through art. Sonnet 60 describes time as an enemy. "Like as the waves make towards the pebbled shore, so do our minutes hasten to their end. Everything flourishes, then decays. Only verse can resist the destruction." It's a bold claim and an anxious one. The poet is fighting mortality with words, asserting immortality while deeply aware of his own finitude. By 1613, Shakespeare had mostly stopped writing. The Tempest was probably his last solo work, though he collaborated with John Fletcher on Henry VIII and possibly The Two Noble Kinsmen. He was wealthy enough to retire. The investments in Stratford property had paid off. He owned the second largest house in town, New Place, with multiple gardens and outbuildings. He'd achieved the gentleman status his father had sought and lost. He spent his final years in Stratford, not London. The theatre was behind him. He witnessed his daughter Judith's marriage to Thomas Quiney in February 1616. The marriage was troubled from the start. Quiney had gotten another woman pregnant, and she died in childbirth, along with the baby, just weeks after the wedding. Shakespeare revised his will shortly after, reducing Judith's inheritance and adding provisions to protect her money from her husband's control. The will itself is the source of one of the most famous puzzles. He left most of his estate to his elder daughter Susanna, a substantial inheritance ensuring her family's prosperity. To Judith, he left money and silver, carefully structured to remain hers alone. To various friends and colleagues, he left small bequests, money for memorial rings. But to his wife Anne, he left only "my second best bed." This single line has generated enormous speculation. Was it an insult? Evidence of a cold marriage? Or was the second best bed actually the marital bed? The best bed being reserved for guests, making this a sentimental gesture. The will's language is legal and practical throughout, not emotional. Reading intention into that one bequest is probably impossible. The marriage remains as mysterious as everything else about Shakespeare's private life. He died on April 23rd, 1616, exactly 52 years after his birth if the traditional birth date is correct. The cause of death is unrecorded. He was buried 2 days later in the chancel of Holy Trinity Church in Stratford, a prestigious location reflecting his status. Above the grave, a monument was erected, showing him holding a quill and paper, identifying him clearly as a writer. The inscription on the gravestone itself carries a curse. "Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones." It's doggerel, barely poetry, possibly written by Shakespeare himself in declining health, or possibly by someone else entirely. But it worked. The grave has never been disturbed. The monument in Holy Trinity Church shows Shakespeare holding a quill, forever frozen in the act of writing. But within 7 years of his death, something far more important than stone memorials appeared. In 1623, two of his former colleagues published what would become the most important book in English literature. John Hemminger and Henry Condell had acted alongside Shakespeare in The King's Men for years. They knew him, worked with him, understood what his plays meant to English theatre, and they recognised something crucial. Most of Shakespeare's plays existed only in the memories of actors and in the company's rough prompt books. Some had been published individually in cheap quarto editions, but these were often pirated, reconstructed from memory, by actors, filled with errors. 18 of Shakespeare's plays had never been printed at all. Without intervention, they would vanish. Hemminger and Condell undertook a massive editorial project. They gathered manuscripts, compared texts, consulted their own memories of performances. They organised 36 plays into a large format book, a folio, the size reserved for serious literature, like the Bible or classical authors. The book cost £1, expensive enough to ensure only the wealthy could buy it. But the price signalled something vital. These plays weren't cheap entertainment. They were literature. The first folio's title page announces Mr. William Shakespeare's comedies, histories and tragedies. The organisation itself was an argument. These aren't random scripts. They're a coherent body of work by a single author, carefully categorised, worthy of preservation and study. The preliminary material includes Ben Jonson's poem To the Memory of My Beloved, the author, Mr. William Shakespeare. Jonson, who'd criticised Shakespeare for lacking classical education, now declared him superior to all the Greek and Roman playwrights. He wasn't just of an age, but for all time. Hemminger and Condell's address to the readers is remarkably candid. They admit they're publishing for profit, yes, but also to preserve what would otherwise be lost. They describe Shakespeare's writing process, claiming his mind and hand went together, that he barely blotted a line. This image of effortless genius would shape Shakespeare's reputation for centuries, though it's probably exaggerated. The manuscripts they worked from likely showed revisions and changes. The first folio preserved Macbeth, Julius Caesar, Twelfth Night, The Tempest, As You Like It, Antony and Cleopatra, and 11 other plays that had never appeared in print. Imagine English literature without them. The loss would be catastrophic. Hemminger and Condell's work was an act of cultural preservation, on par with the recovery of classical manuscripts during the Renaissance. Only about 750 copies were printed. Roughly 235 survive today, scattered across libraries and private collections. Each is worth millions. The book's publication marked a turning point. Shakespeare, the popular playwright, became Shakespeare, the literary giant, an author whose works deserved the same reverence as Virgil or Ovid. But reverence came with a problem. As Shakespeare's reputation grew, people started asking uncomfortable questions. How could a man from Stratford, with a grammar school education, no university degree, no aristocratic connections, write plays that displayed such vast knowledge? The works reference classical mythology, Italian geography, French court customs, falconry, law, medicine, military strategy, navigation. The vocabulary is immense, the learning apparent on every page. The first doubts appeared in the 19th century, though the seeds were planted earlier. Delia Bacon, an American woman with no relation to Francis Bacon despite her name, published a book in 1857 arguing that Shakespeare couldn't have written the plays. She proposed they were created by a group including Francis Bacon, Walter Raleigh, and Edmund Spenser, noblemen and intellectuals who had to hide their authorship because theatre was beneath their status. Her theory was largely ignored at first, but it opened a door. If Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare, who did? The authorship question became a cottage industry. Candidate after candidate emerged. Francis Bacon remained popular with some theorists. Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, gained a substantial following. Christopher Marlowe, supposedly faked his death and continued writing under Shakespeare's name. Even Queen Elizabeth herself was proposed. The arguments follow similar patterns. They point to gaps in the historical record, the lack of manuscripts in Shakespeare's hand, the absence of books in his will. They highlight the play's aristocratic settings and detailed knowledge of court life. How could a glovemaker's son know these things? They note that Shakespeare's signatures are inconsistent, his name spelled multiple ways. Surely the greatest writer in English would know how to spell his own name. Each objection has an answer rooted in historical context. Spelling wasn't standardized in the 16th century. Even educated people spelled their names differently at different times. The lack of manuscripts isn't surprising because paper was expensive and discarded once plays were printed or performed. Books weren't listed in wills because they had little monetary value and were often given away before death. As for knowledge of court life, Shakespeare spent 20 years in London's theatrical world, performing at court, mixing with educated patrons, reading voraciously. He didn't need to be an aristocrat to observe aristocrats. The grammar school education objection reveals class bias more than historical insight. Stratford's grammar school was excellent by the standards of the time. Students learned Latin thoroughly. Read Ovid, Virgil, Terence, and Plautus. This classical foundation appears throughout Shakespeare's work. His plots often come from sources available in Latin or in English translations. There's no mystery here. What the authorship theories really reveal is discomfort with genius emerging from ordinary origins. The assumption that great art requires aristocratic birth or university credentials says more about our prejudices than about Shakespeare. Ben Jonson, who knew Shakespeare personally, had no doubts, neither did any of his contemporaries. The questioning only began 2 centuries after his death, when the man had become mythical and the social context had been forgotten. Professional Shakespeare scholars, the people who spend careers studying the period, the language, the theatre, are virtually unanimous. Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare. The evidence is overwhelming once you understand the historical context. But the conspiracy theories persist because they offer narrative satisfaction. A secret author, hidden codes, elaborate cover-ups. It's more dramatic than the truth, which is that a brilliant man from a small town moved to London, worked incredibly hard, learned his craft and wrote masterpieces. The real mystery isn't authorship, it's how he did it. How does anyone create Hamlet or Lear? Genius remains unexplainable, whether it emerges from Stratford or Oxford, from a university or a theatre company. The plays exist. They changed literature permanently. That's what matters. By the 18th century, Shakespeare's reputation had fully solidified. Samuel Johnson published an annotated edition in 1765, treating the plays with scholarly seriousness previously reserved for classical authors. Johnson defended Shakespeare against critics who complained about his violations of classical dramatic rules. The Greeks insisted on unity of time, place, and action. Shakespeare ignored all three. Johnson argued that truth to human nature mattered more than arbitrary rules. Shakespeare's mixing of comedy and tragedy in the same play wasn't a flaw, but an innovation reflecting life's actual texture. The Romantic poets elevated Shakespeare even higher. Coleridge lectured extensively on the plays, analysing their psychological depth. He argued that Shakespeare's characters weren't types but individuals, each with distinctive psychology. Hamlet's hesitation wasn't a plot device, but a window into a specific consciousness. This approach, reading the plays as psychological realism, became dominant and remains influential. Germany embraced Shakespeare with particular intensity. Goethe and Schiller both revered him. August Wilhelm Schlegel's German translations, published between 1797 and 1810, were so good they essentially created a German Shakespeare, absorbed into that nation's literary canon as thoroughly as any native author. To this day, Shakespeare is performed more frequently in Germany than anywhere except England. The Victorian era brought massive scholarly additions and an almost religious reverence. Shakespeare became a moral teacher, his works mined for uplifting sentiments and wisdom about human nature. This sanitizing impulse led to Bowdlerized editions, like those of Thomas Bowdler, who removed anything he considered indecent. The sexual jokes, the violence, the darkness, all softened or cut entirely. Families could read Shakespeare without blushing, but sanitizing Shakespeare means gutting Shakespeare. The plays aren't morally simple. They're ethically complex, often disturbing, filled with ambiguity. Measure for Measure presents a duke who manipulates everyone around him, supposedly for good purposes, but the methods are questionable and the ending uncomfortable. Is this a comedy? Technically yes, because it ends in marriage. But the marriages feel forced, the resolution unstable. Victorian attempts to extract clear moral lessons miss the point. The 20th century brought new approaches. Psychoanalytic criticism read the plays through Freud, finding Oedipal complexes in Hamlet and subconscious desires throughout. Marxist critics analysed class conflict and economic structures. Feminist scholars examined the treatment of women, noting both the strong female characters and the patriarchal assumptions. Post-colonial readings explored the Tempest's treatment of Caliban, seeing colonialism's violence beneath the surface. Each generation finds different things in Shakespeare because the plays are capacious enough to contain multiple meanings. They're not propaganda for any single viewpoint. They present situations, develop characters, and let audiences draw conclusions. Shylock in The Merchant of Venice is a villain in the play's structure, but his "hath not a Jew eyes" speech is so powerful that many productions now play him sympathetically, turning the play into a critique of the Christian character's cruelty. Shakespeare wrote that possibility into the text, whether intentionally or not. Performance history reveals these shifting interpretations vividly. 19th century Hamlets were melancholic scholars. 20th century versions emphasized his violence and erratic behavior. Laurence Olivier's 1948 film presented him as paralyzed by an Oedipal complex. Kenneth Branagh's 1996 version played him as vigorous and decisive, the delay caused by external circumstances rather than internal hesitation. Both readings work because the text supports multiple approaches. The plays have been adapted into every conceivable form: operas, ballets, novels, films, graphic novels, video games. West Side Story transforms Romeo and Juliet into 1950s New York gang warfare. Throne of Blood relocates Macbeth to feudal Japan. 10 Things I Hate About You updates The Taming of the Shrew as a teen comedy. Some adaptations are reverent, others radical, but all acknowledge Shakespeare as the source. In education, Shakespeare remains mandatory, though the methods have changed. Victorian students memorized speeches and analysed moral themes. Modern classrooms often start with performance, getting students on their feet speaking the lines, because these are scripts meant for actors, not just readers. The language is challenging, genuinely difficult for contemporary students, but the stories and characters remain accessible. Teenagers recognise Hamlet's angst, Juliet's passion, Macbeth's ambition. The question of relevance persists. Why read a playwright from 400 years ago? The language is archaic, the cultural references obscure, the worldview distant from ours. Yet the plays keep speaking. They address jealousy, ambition, love, betrayal, power, mortality, identity. The human fundamentals haven't changed. Technology evolves, social structures shift, but the emotional core of human experience remains recognizable across centuries. Shakespeare's influence on the English language itself is nearly impossible to measure because it's so pervasive. Phrases that feel like common expressions originated in his plays. Break the ice, wild goose chase, heart of gold, tongue-tied, wear your heart on your sleeve, hundreds of others. He didn't necessarily invent all of them, but he popularized them, gave them currency, embedded them so deeply that we've forgotten their source. The plays have become cultural reference points, shorthand for complex ideas. Calling someone a Romeo or a Scrooge. Wait, that's Dickens. Calling someone a Romeo immediately communicates something about their personality. Describing a situation as Kafkaesque. No, that's also different. Describing a difficult choice as Hamlet-like conveys the paralysis of overthinking. The characters and stories have transcended their original context to become archetypal. This process continues. Each new generation stages the plays differently, finds new meanings, argues about interpretations. Shakespeare remains alive not despite his age, but because of his depth. There's always more to discover, another angle to explore, a different performance choice to try. The question of authorship has generated mountains of speculation and entire alternative theories. Anti-Stratfordians argue that William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon couldn't have written the plays. The reasoning varies but centres on class and education. How could a glover's son from a provincial town possess the knowledge displayed in the works? The plays demonstrate familiarity with court politics, Italian geography, legal terminology, falconry, military strategy, foreign languages. Critics argue this requires aristocratic education and experience. Candidates proposed as the real author include Francis Bacon, Christopher Marlowe, Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, and even Queen Elizabeth herself. Each theory constructs elaborate explanations for why the true author needed a frontman. Oxford was too high-ranking to publish under his own name. Marlowe faked his death and continued writing in secret. The evidence presented typically involves cryptograms, hidden messages in the texts, and biographical coincidences. The mainstream scholarly consensus remains that William Shakespeare of Stratford wrote the plays attributed to him. The evidence is substantial. His name appears on published quartos. Fellow playwrights and actors who knew him personally, Ben Jonson and others, wrote about him as the author. The first folio's dedication explicitly identifies him. Legal documents connect him to the theatre business. No contemporary ever suggested someone else wrote his works. The knowledge objection doesn't withstand scrutiny. Shakespeare didn't need to visit Italy to write about it. Books existed describing foreign locations. Other playwrights from similar backgrounds, Marlowe was a shoemaker's son, displayed comparable range. The plays contain factual errors that an educated aristocrat presumably wouldn't make. Italian cities are given sea coasts they don't possess. Legal terminology is sometimes misapplied. These look like the mistakes of someone working from second-hand sources, exactly what we'd expect from a talented provincial writer. The authorship controversy reveals more about class prejudice than literary history. The assumption that genius requires aristocratic breeding is fundamentally anti-democratic. It suggests that ordinary people cannot produce extraordinary art. Yet history contradicts this repeatedly. Dickens was a factory worker as a child. Keats was a surgeon's apprentice. The notion that background determines capability is precisely what the plays themselves often challenge. What we can say with certainty is that someone wrote these plays in the 1590s and early 1600s, and that person was deeply involved in London theatre. The works demonstrate intimate knowledge of stagecraft, actor capabilities, audience psychology. They were written by a working playwright who understood what would succeed in performance. Whether that person was named William Shakespeare or used that as a pseudonym, the plays exist and their authorship debate, while fascinating to some, doesn't change their content or impact. The Globe Theatre burned down during a performance of Henry VIII in 1613, when a theatrical cannon misfired and ignited the thatched roof. It was rebuilt within a year, but Shakespeare's active writing career was essentially over. He returned to Stratford, made his will, and died in 1616 at age 52. The cause of death is unrecorded. The monument erected in Holy Trinity Church shows him holding a quill and paper, identified as a writer. 7 years later, in 1623, two of his fellow actors, John Heminger and Henry Condell, published the first folio. This collected edition contained 36 plays, half of which had never been printed before. Without this publication, we would have lost Macbeth, Julius Caesar, Twelfth Night, The Tempest, Antony and Cleopatra, and others. The plays existed only as theatrical scripts in the company's possession. Heminger and Condell undertook the project to preserve their colleagues' work, not for profit, but for posterity. The first folio's preface, written by Ben Jonson, declared Shakespeare not of an age, but for all time. This was published 7 years after Shakespeare's death, so Jonson was making a prediction, not reporting established fact. Yet the prediction proved accurate in ways Jonson couldn't have imagined. How does a playwright from the early modern period retain relevance 4 centuries later? Part of the answer is institutional. Schools teach Shakespeare, theatres produce him, scholars study him, creating a self-perpetuating cycle. Once someone becomes canonical, they stay canonical because resources and attention flow toward them. This doesn't explain the initial success or why the cycle began, but it explains persistence. The deeper answer involves the play's construction. They're open enough to accommodate wildly different interpretations, but structured enough to remain coherent. They address universal human experiences through specific historical stories. They contain language that works both as beautiful poetry and as dramatic action. Characters reveal themselves through speech in ways that feel psychologically realistic, despite the stylized verse form. Consider King Lear. An old king divides his kingdom among his daughters based on their declarations of love. The two who flatter him receive everything. The one who speaks honestly gets nothing. This setup is a fairy tale, but what follows is brutal psychological realism. Lear goes mad from the realization that he misjudged everything. His suffering is cosmic in scale, but intimately human in detail. The play can be read as political allegory, family drama, existential tragedy, or critique of power. Productions emphasize different aspects, but all find support in the text. Or, take Othello, where a Moorish general in Venetian service is manipulated by his ensign, Iago, into believing his wife has been unfaithful. The play addresses race, jealousy, trust, manipulation, and military culture. Iago's motivations remain ambiguous. He gives multiple contradictory explanations, making him endlessly fascinating and disturbing. Othello's tragedy stems from his outsider status and his ultimate acceptance of Venetian prejudices against himself. Modern productions grapple with the play's racial dynamics in ways earlier eras often ignored or minimized. The comedies present different challenges. Modern audiences sometimes struggle with them because the humor depends on conventions we no longer share. Disguised plots where characters fail to recognize each other despite minimal costume changes require theatrical acceptance. Gender dynamics in plays like The Taming of the Shrew can seem deeply problematic. Catherine's final speech submitting to her husband reads as either ironic or misogynistic, depending on performance choices. Yet the comedies also contain moments of surprising depth. As You Like It features the melancholy Jacques delivering the "All the World's a Stage" speech, a meditation on human life's progression through 7 ages that remains moving. Twelfth Night balances romantic confusion with Malvolio's humiliation, a subplot that can turn cruel. The Fool Feste sings "The Rain It Raineth Every Day," a song that shifts from comic to melancholic, depending on context. The late romances, The Winter's Tale, Cymbeline, The Tempest move toward reconciliation and forgiveness. Characters separated for years reunite, Those presumed dead return, magic and providence intervene. These plays feel different from the earlier tragedies, less concerned with justice than with grace. The Winter's Tale features one of literature's most famous stage directions, exit pursued by a bear, and ends with a statue coming to life, Hermione restored to Leontes after 16 years. The Tempest is often read as Shakespeare's farewell. Prospero, the exiled duke who controls the island through magic, eventually breaks his staff and drowns his book, relinquishing power. His final speech asks the audience to release him through applause. The identification of Prospero with Shakespeare himself is probably too neat, but the play does feel valedictory, concerned with endings and letting go. Shakespeare's influence on subsequent literature is impossible to fully catalogue. English Romantic poets revered him. Keats kept a bust of Shakespeare in his room. Coleridge's lectures on the plays shaped 19th century interpretation. The Victorians saw him as a moral teacher. Modernists appreciated his formal experimentation and psychological depth. Post-colonial critics examine his representation of race and empire. Feminist scholars analyse his female characters and gender dynamics. Writers have responded to him directly. Tom Stoppard's Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead tells Hamlet from the perspective of two minor characters. Jane Smiley's A Thousand Acres retells King Lear as an Iowa farm family drama. The science fiction novel Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel features a travelling theatre troupe performing Shakespeare after civilization's collapse, arguing that art remains essential even in catastrophe. Film has embraced Shakespeare since cinema's beginning. Laurence Olivier's mid-century adaptations brought the plays to mass audiences. Franco Zeffirelli's Romeo and Juliet cast young actors and emphasised the story's youthful passion. Baz Luhrmann's version relocated it to contemporary Verona Beach with guns instead of swords, but retained the original dialogue. Kenneth Branagh's Hamlet used the full text, running over 4 hours. Julie Taymor's Titus adapted the bloodiest play with hallucinogenic visuals. Akira Kurosawa's Throne of Blood and Ran reimagined Macbeth and King Lear in feudal Japan, proving the stories transcend their English setting. These aren't translations but transformations, finding equivalents in different cultural contexts. The core narratives about ambition, madness, betrayal, and family remain recognizable across vast cultural distances. The plays continue to generate controversy. Modern productions regularly update settings and interpretations. All female casts, race-conscious casting, contemporary costumes. These choices spark debates about fidelity versus innovation. Purists argue for historical authenticity. Others contend that radical reinterpretation keeps the works alive. Both positions claim to honour Shakespeare's legacy, just through different means. Educational approaches have shifted toward accessibility. Facing pages with modern English translations help students navigate the language. Film clips demonstrate performance possibilities. Digital resources provide historical context. The goal is lowering barriers while maintaining the original's richness. Some argue this dilutes the experience. Others counter that excluding students through difficulty serves no one. The question persists of what we gain from continued engagement with these texts. Why not replace them with contemporary works addressing modern concerns in modern language? The answer isn't that Shakespeare is better than current writers, but that the accumulated weight of interpretation and adaptation has made the plays into cultural infrastructure. They're reference points everyone shares, enabling communication across generations and contexts. When someone describes a toxic relationship as Othello-like or political overreach as Macbeth's ambition, they're using shorthand that carries centuries of meaning. This shared vocabulary has value beyond the original texts. It's how cultures maintain continuity while allowing change. Shakespeare's works also demonstrate that art can survive its original context. The plays were written for audiences who no longer exist, in a language that has significantly changed, addressing political situations long resolved. Yet they remain vital. This offers hope that current artistic creation might also transcend its moment, that what seems time-bound today might speak to futures we cannot imagine. The plays are not perfect. They contain offensive stereotypes, problematic politics, and outdated worldviews. Shylock's Jewishness is presented through anti-Semitic tropes. Othello's race is exoticized. Caliban in the Tempest can be read as a colonial subject, his attempted resistance punished. Modern productions grapple with these elements, sometimes cutting them, sometimes confronting them directly, sometimes attempting to subvert them through performance. Engaging with Shakespeare now means engaging with this history of interpretation and appropriation. The plays arrive with baggage. We cannot read them innocently, as if encountering them fresh. Every production responds to previous productions. Every reading exists in dialogue with centuries of scholarship. This density can be enriching or overwhelming. What remains clear is that the plays have not exhausted their possibilities. New performances continue finding unexplored dimensions. Scholars still publish books, offering fresh perspectives. Adaptations keep appearing in unexpected forms. 400 years after his death, Shakespeare remains not a monument, but a living presence, constantly reinterpreted and constantly relevant. The conversation continues because the plays reward sustained attention. There's always another layer to uncover, another question to ask, another way to understand what these works reveal about human nature and the possibilities of language. That's why we keep returning to them, why they keep returning to us. 400 years separates us from Shakespeare's death, yet the plays refuse to become historical artifacts. They keep generating new meanings, provoking fresh arguments, demanding reinterpretation. Every generation believes it has finally understood what the plays really mean, only for the next generation to discover something entirely different hidden in the same lines. This isn't because Shakespeare was prophetic or because he somehow anticipated modern concerns. It's because he built structures capacious enough to contain contradictions. Hamlet can be paralyzed by thought or driven by circumstances, depending on how you stage it. Both readings live in the text simultaneously. The plays don't resolve into single meanings. They proliferate meanings, offering different faces to different eras. The language itself keeps evolving in reception. Phrases that originated in the plays have become so embedded in English that native speakers use them without awareness of their source. We've inherited Shakespeare's vocabulary for describing human experience. When we talk about jealousy, ambition, love, betrayal, we're often unconsciously echoing his formulations. He didn't just write about these experiences, he gave us the language to recognize and articulate them. The authorship controversy will likely never completely disappear because it offers narrative satisfaction that facts cannot. A hidden aristocrat writing under a pseudonym is more dramatic than a talented provincial working incredibly hard. But the conspiracy theories ultimately miss what matters. Someone wrote these plays in London between 1590 and 1613. That person understood theatre intimately, knew what would work on stage, and possessed extraordinary linguistic gifts. Whether his name was actually William Shakespeare, or whether he used that as a front, the plays exist and they've shaped 4 centuries of literature, theatre, and thought. The real mystery isn't authorship, it's creation itself. How does any human mind produce Lear's storm speeches or Hamlet's soliloquies? How does someone invent Falstaff's wit or Lady Macbeth's ambition? Genius remains inexplicable, regardless of its origin. We can trace influences, identify sources, analyze techniques, but the final leap from competence to mastery defies complete explanation. What we're left with is the work. 37 plays, 154 sonnets, several longer poems. Some are greater than others. The late comedies don't match the tragedies' power. The early histories show a writer still learning his craft, but even the lesser works contain moments of extraordinary achievement, flashes of the intelligence that would produce the masterpieces. Shakespeare didn't write for eternity. He wrote for next week's performance, for audiences who paid a penny to stand in the pit, for actors who needed roles that showcased their abilities. The plays were commercial products in a competitive entertainment industry. They succeeded because they gave audiences what they wanted while also pushing beyond simple satisfaction into genuine artistic achievement. That combination of commercial viability and artistic depth is rare. Most art that aims for popularity sacrifices complexity. Most complex art accepts limited audiences. Shakespeare managed both simultaneously. The groundlings got their sword fights and dirty jokes. The educated patrons got their classical allusions and philosophical depth. Somehow, the same play satisfied both groups without feeling compromised. The plays have been conscripted into every imaginable agenda. Monarchists and republicans both claim him. Christians find religious allegory, while secularists note his skepticism. Conservatives see traditional values affirmed while radicals discover subversion. Everyone finds what they're looking for because the plays don't insist on single interpretations. They present situations and let audiences draw conclusions. This openness is deliberate craft, not accident. Shakespeare could have written morality plays with clear lessons. He chose not to. He created characters who argue persuasively for opposing positions. He structured plays so different readings remain valid. The ambiguity is the point, an acknowledgement that human experience resists simple categorization. Modern productions continue testing the play's limits. Gender-blind casting, updated settings, radical cuts and rearrangements, all these experiments reveal that the works can absorb enormous change while remaining recognizable. You can set Romeo and Juliet in contemporary Los Angeles, or Macbeth in Soviet Russia, and the stories still function. The specific details matter less than the underlying structures of desire, ambition, betrayal, reconciliation. But the language matters enormously. Translations exist in hundreds of languages, some excellent, but something essential disappears as in the transfer. The wordplay, the rhythms, the density of meaning, these are inseparable from the specific sounds and syntax of early modern English. This creates a problem for global accessibility. The plays are tied to a language most of the world doesn't speak natively, yet they've become international cultural property anyway. German theatres program Shakespeare as frequently as English ones. Japanese film directors have created definitive interpretations. The plays have escaped their linguistic origins to become world literature, recognized across cultures as examining fundamental human concerns. Education keeps them alive, but also risks killing them through overfamiliarity. Students forced to analyze Romeo and Juliet in 9th grade sometimes develop lifelong resistance. The language is genuinely difficult for contemporary readers. 400 years of linguistic change creates barriers, but the difficulty also creates rewards. Working through the language to reach the meaning teaches close reading in ways simpler texts cannot. The plays remain controversial precisely because they remain relevant. If they were safely historical, no one would argue about them. The ongoing debates about whether The Merchant of Venice is anti-Semitic or whether The Taming of the Shrew is misogynistic matter because people still stage these plays for contemporary audiences. The works aren't museum pieces, they're living documents that keep generating new problems and possibilities. Shakespeare's influence on English literature is so pervasive, it's nearly invisible. Every writer working in English exists downstream from him. The expectation that characters should have psychological depth, that plots can mix comedy and tragedy, that language can be both beautiful and dramatic. All these derive partly from his example. He didn't invent these principles, but he demonstrated their possibilities so effectively that they became foundational. 4 centuries is a long time. Most art from the early 17th century has been forgotten. The plays that were popular when Shakespeare was writing have vanished except as scholarly footnotes. Yet his work persists, constantly performed, constantly studied, constantly adapted. This isn't because of conspiracy or institutional inertia. It's because the plays keep working. They engage audiences, they reward attention. They offer something that justifies the effort of engaging with difficult language and unfamiliar conventions. What that something is varies by person and era. For some it's the language itself, the extraordinary density and beauty of the verse. For others it's the psychological insight, the sense that Shakespeare understood human nature with unusual clarity. Some value the stories, the plots that have become archetypal. Others appreciate the theatrical craft, the way scenes are structured for maximum dramatic impact. All these readings are valid because the plays contain all these elements. They're not just vehicles for beautiful language or psychological studies or well-made plots. They're all of these simultaneously, unified through Shakespeare's particular genius for synthesis. The man himself remains shadowy. We know external facts about his life, but almost nothing about his inner experience. He left no letters, no diary, no memoir. The sonnets offer glimpses but filtered through literary convention. We cannot know what he believed about politics, religion, art or anything else with certainty. His opinions are lost, only the work remains. Perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps the self-erasure was intentional, a recognition that the plays matter more than their creator. Shakespeare put everything into the work and kept nothing back for biography. He gave us Hamlet and Lear and Falstaff and Cleopatra, and in return asked only that we pay attention to them rather than to him. So we do. We keep staging the plays, teaching them, arguing about them, finding new meanings in familiar lines. 400 years after his death, the conversation continues. It will continue as long as people care about what theatre can accomplish, what language can express, what it means to be human in a complicated world. The plays endure because they address questions that don't have final answers, only better and worse provisional responses. They're not solved by interpretation. They're opened up, revealing new dimensions with each encounter. That inexhaustibility is what keeps us returning, what ensures that Shakespeare remains not a monument from the past, but a presence in the continuing present, still asking questions we haven't finished answering.